Hello, and thank you for joining us for the latest chapter of Trader Talks. I'm Matt Lawson, and I'll be your host on today's episode. I'm delighted to have you join us here for today's discussion. Today, we're going to focus on the used car operation. I'm the Vice President of Dealer Software and OEM at Trader. I'm delighted to be a part of the Trader Talk series, both as a host and a panelist in the past. Genuinely, I really think that these discussions have had a lot of value for dealers, and we've been getting some great feedback, which is why we're continuing with the series. And what we're really trying to do is bring in subject matter experts across our business with solid insights in different aspects of the retail operation in order to be able to help dealers in the time that we're currently in. Today's episode, we're going to focus on the used car operation and something that our dealer partners seemingly execute day in, day out. But one thing specifically in the used car operation we're going to look to focus on today is vehicle appraisals. And specifically, we're going to get right into the topic of virtual appraisals. And, given the current market conditions, we think that's a very relevant conversation. And we've been asked a lot from different dealers about different tactics and strategies to deploy. So that's what we're going to discuss today. As such, I'm joined by two experts in this industry of inventory management, each with different perspectives. Our first panelist here comes from south of the border, and his name is Fabian Macken. Fabian is a vice president of performance management at vAuto, and in his role, Fabian oversees the performance management team, which supports client retention, new client launch processes inside dealerships all across the US and Canada. Fabian joined the business in 2009 as a performance manager following 20 years of dealership experience, including being a general manager and a general sales manager at various locations. Welcome, Fabian. We're delighted to have you today.
Thanks so much, Matt. I'm really glad to be here.
That's great. We also have with us Todd Temple, and Todd is the National Sales Director for vAuto at Trader across Canada. Todd brings over 8 years of direct know-how experience with the vAuto solution in Canada, coupled with over 20 years dealership experience. Todd is widely recognized as one of the leading experts on this topic today, and we're delighted to have him on today's panel. Welcome to Trader Talks, Todd.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, Fabian. Glad to be here.
All right, guys, let's get into it. We're going to talk appraisals and used car ops, but I thought first, Fabian, I think this is a good question for you. What is vAuto seeing just on both sides of the border, broad strokes with used car operations right now?
Yeah, so I think depending on the dynamics of the market, where the client is located, it can be kind of, a little bit different. If you're in a market that's kind of reopened, and you're starting to see a little foot traffic into the dealership, and that there's a little more openness from the consumer standpoint to, interact with people. Business is starting to, more or less, I guess, return back to normal levels a little more quickly. If you're in a market where it's a little more restrictive, that there's some sentiment with the general public to be a little more cautious about wanting to physically, go anywhere or engage with people on that kind of level, it's starting to recover, but the recovery is a little more slow.
Interesting. And do you see any differences between Canada and the US, like in particular?
I'm not sure that I would say that there's a remarkable difference between the US and Canada. Again, I think it's highly dependent on, the specific location of the customer. But I think, across Canada, just like here in the US, in those markets that are starting to kind of reopen, where there's a little bit more comfort and confidence with the consumer base, that, people are starting to kind of see things come back into play. I would say that in those markets where things are opening up a little bit, one of the interesting dynamics is that there is a pretty significant enthusiasm to acquire more cars because, when the pandemic was in full effect, people just obviously weren't doing a lot of business, so they weren't taking a lot of trades. There wasn't a lot of wholesale acquisition taking place. A lot of places, auctions are closed. So now that kind of things are coming out of that state, geez, we don't have a lot of cars laying around.
Yeah, that's interesting. Todd, what are you seeing?
Yeah, so I was gonna bring that question actually back to Fabian, and just ask, are you seeing in general in the areas where the dealers have had an opportunity to partially or fully reopen, are the dealers taking an optimistic view south of the border in terms of inventory levels, or are they trying to shrink their inventory levels? What are you seeing down south, Fabian?
Well, I think there's optimism, right? And that's just kind of the nature of the beast with the car business. I think, car people are really resilient, really strong people. We've demonstrated an ability to go through recoveries, that's pretty remarkable over my career. But while there's a ton of optimism, probably, I think there's also a little bit of caution with respect to wanting to make sure that as the market starts to recover and prices start to accelerate, that everybody is really focused on trying to make sure that we sell a car within the same market that we've acquired it in. In other words, managing the turn of your inventory and making sure that you're not going to get yourself in a trick bag, by, owning cars at a number that you can't make sense of is a pretty high priority of people. And, I think one other interesting dynamic that's in play is, as we kind of progress further on in the year, there are a couple of events that typically happen every year towards the end of the summer where, the model year changeover comes into play. Kids start going back to school, even though they haven't been in school,
Yeah.
Generally, there's a little, dip in wholesale values. And I think that, the really smart operators are focused on making sure that we don't get into, some kind of a bad situation because of that dynamic.
Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah. So what would you think, Fabian, would be the biggest challenge? Like if we were to, talking or just focus on the Canadian market for a moment, what do you think the biggest challenge for Canadian dealers is going to be over the course of the summer?
Well, I think it's going to be much like, the same thing that we see in the US. I think that there's going to be a shortage of new car inventory because obviously, most of the OEMs have been shut down. That's going to create a lot of pressure on the new car sales volume, which in turn is going to create, a real shortage of trade-in opportunities. So I think it's going to be critical that, every dealer is really focused on every one of those opportunities. I just don't think you're going to be in a position to let anything slip through the cracks.
So what do you, like when you're talking with your performance management team, what are the things that you're asking them to focus on with dealers?
Well, I think it's kind of, part and parcel. What we've really kind of all seen happen here is that we've paid a lot of lip service as an industry to, this digital retailing concept. We should be able to sell cars to customers like Amazon sells things to customers. And I think, we've all seen that, the future is going to look like that. But the truth is, this pandemic has made it painfully obvious to everybody, clients, us, you guys, that while we think that that's kind of an important initiative, we don't know how to do it. And we're certainly in no way, shape, or form in a position to do it today. And there are a lot of moving parts to that. And one of those, obviously, is one of the things that I know you guys want to spend a little time talking about today, which is the remote appraisal. Working a deal, providing numbers to a customer when they're not there. It's a big gap. And, honestly, in part, I think, we created the gap and made it because we just didn't want to do that.
Yeah.
Sure.
So what do you see as, as we make this shift, given those market conditions, what do dealers need to evolve into? What is the sort of guidance that we want to provide to them so that they can, operate in this market, given that's our new reality?
Yeah, so I think the first piece of the puzzle is just, getting the right mental outlook. I spent 25 years in retail trying to go out of my way to not give a number to a customer because, I felt like there was going to be a complete lack of control. If I did that, boy, it's, all bets are off. And I think, we've got to go 180. We got to rush to have that conversation in a very transparent manner with a customer. And in and of itself, that's a big shift. I mean, that's going to be a hard turn of a big boat to get everybody on board with that. And then I think, once we achieve that kind of mental shift, then we have to implement a specific measurable process to, really examine what kind of level of performance that we have. I mean, I think we've been really instrumental through the vAuto performance management team to get people to embrace the idea that I ought to really measure and track how effectively we trade for cars. But I think, using that same standard to measure how effectively we're making a deal with somebody that's not physically in front of us is going to be a critical piece of the puzzle.
So for our audience, can you explain a little bit around one of the core metrics that vAuto dealers pay attention to as their look to book ratios? Can you explain a little bit about what look to book ratio is and how we're working with dealers to try and help them improve that ratio given the market circumstances?
Yeah, so I mean, look to book is pretty simple, right? I look at this many trades and what percentage of those am I able to end up making a deal with. But I would say that while on the surface that seems simple, there are a lot of things that go into that. So, one of the issues that we seem to run into a lot with clients is that we can measure and track the appraisals that they put into the software. But the question really ought to be, do we get all the appraisals into the software to begin with? So, it might be a matter of kind of peeling the onion back a little bit and trying to think through, okay, who's having that initial contact with the client and where do we start that process? And in a lot of cases, it might be the CRM. So we get the customer data and information along with the trade-in information into the CRM. What steps are we taking to make sure that it's going directly from the CRM into the vAuto system? In other scenarios, the CRM might not be the right approach. We might be looking at ensure that we're getting all those trades in via the mobile app. And maybe we need to involve the sales representative as opposed to a management staff person to, really make sure that we, start out with all the appraisals. And then we start evaluating, how successful we're being both by salesperson, appraiser, and if you take it a step further, really the source. So, best practice, in my opinion, would be to say, I'm not just going to look at all appraisals the same way. I'm going to look at an appraisal that's, a car deal I'm working with a customer trying to buy another car differently than an appraisal that I would be doing to acquire a car in the wholesale environment. And, beyond that, I might be looking to set up a source where I can measure that sight unseen or remote appraisal, within the context of the appraisals that I'm doing as I'm working a car deal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. So what's your view with now all these different digital retailing tools out there and how consumers can start seeing different numbers based on whatever catalog the dealer might be using in that trade component of the digital retailing tool set, and then what the number is that the dealer might land on inside vAuto from an ACV perspective? A lot of times those two things they're not met with synergy, right? So
Right.
how should dealers think about that process upstream and be able to solve that issue?
Well, so I think that part really begins with having, a really clear conversation with the client and setting an expectation up front. In other words, I want to be having a communication to say, hey, I'm Fabian. I'm going to be the guy, taking a look at the number on your car. I would assume you've done a little bit of research. Would you mind sharing with me how you did that research? And really trying to get a clear understanding of what the expectations of the customer are. And then, giving them a little bit of an education about how I am going to come up with that number. So, I'm working with an independent third-party software company that's going to help me shop your car against the other vehicles that are out there in the marketplace. Um, both in the wholesale and the retail environment. And, I'd like you to be part of this, discovery or conversation that we're going to have about how we arrive at that number. And then making sure that, we go so far as to ask the right questions to the client, ask them to participate in, providing us accurate condition details about the car with photos. And, lately what we've been really seeing some guys having a ton of success doing is actually doing a video walk around,
Nice.
So, actually getting the client involved and jumping on, FaceTime or, one of these video chat platforms to walk around their car. If they're not going to be there, and they'd like to get top dollar, it'd sure be helpful if I really had a good understanding of what your car looked like.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thanks for sharing that. Todd, what are you hearing from dealers that you're talking to who are evaluating the vAuto provision suite that maybe don't have it today? What are those conversations looking like?
Yeah, that's a good question, Matt. So again, we're talking to dealers that are in different regions who are, working with different rules and have progressed sort of at different rates across the country in terms of getting back up to speed. But to one of the points that Fabian made earlier, a lot of dealers have kind of had this aha moment in regards to, the industry having paid this lip service to digital retailing or e-commerce or whatever word we use to describe it. So dealers, the majority of the dealers that we're speaking to, Matt, are, they've come to the conclusion that their sales process needs to change. And they're working aggressively on making those changes and trying to adapt to, what's kind of come to be called now the new normal. There are a few dealers sitting out there in the weeds who, they're kind of waiting for things to go back to the way they were, but the vast majority have come to the conclusion that things are going to be different and that they need to adapt and they need to do it very quickly. So along that same sort of train of thought, what are dealers thinking about? Dealers are thinking about price relevance, right? And the fact that price relevance needs to be, prioritized more than it ever has been. Consumer behavior it has already changed with the pandemic. And dealers are going to want to ensure that their vehicles are at all times rationally positioned out there in the marketplace. Dealers are figuring out new ways to communicate with their customers. And Fabian touched on a few of those. They're using, everything from Facebook Live, e-commerce tools, digital retailing tools, Zoom calls, Teams calls, you name it. Whatever dealers are using, they're taking a shot at trying to transact with the customer, whether it be over the phone or in a virtual scenario like we're in right now today. So it's been it's been a pretty cool experience, I'll say, to watch dealers really hustle into this. And the forward thinking ones have really, they initially, of course, there was a shock to the market, but today I'm hearing, really positive sentiment from the dealers who, while there still is some pain, they see the fact that this could speed up their ability. And if they get really good at it, they do recognize that they will have a competitive advantage against those that sit in the weeds once we get over the other side of this.
Great, thanks. What are you seeing from existing vAuto dealer partners in terms of moving through different aspects of the vAuto portfolio and adding options like autoTRADER or things like that? Has there been an influx, or are we seeing dealers be more mindful of that? What's the current state of play there?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, you touched on it right there in your question, Matt. I mean, when this first hit, there was an absolute avalanche of requests for our autoTRADER product, which, just as it sounds, automatically creates descriptions for dealer inventory. With less people in the store and less capacity to do some of these tasks, we've got some technology that can take care of those tasks for them. So autoTRADER is one. Another component that's in our tool set that we've had a number of dealers looking at as of recent is the provisioning module. And that's stemming from a lot of discussions that Fabian's team's having with the dealers. The dealers are really, they've gone through every line in their financial statement, and they're really looking at creating as many efficiencies as possible. And one of the things that the provisioning tool does is it allows dealers to build a really clear strategy for their used cars that pivots off of their day's supply. So they're really thinking about how can we get tighter and tighter control on that and not have any wastage in terms of overstocking, understocking, missing out on segments that they don't know are hot segments at this moment in time in the marketplace.
Todd, as I understand it, there's also some exciting news to share just in terms of inventory management and the portfolio of the auto products for the Canadian market. Can you shed some light with our audience on what we're working on and what they can expect to see in the back half of this year and next year?
Yeah, for sure, Matt. I mean, the first thing that I want to mention is a product that we just launched 3 days ago, and that product is called iRecon 2.0. So just a quick backstory on iRecon. That's a company that vAuto acquired a little more than a year ago, and immediately pulled the thing apart. And their crack team of product people started working in a collaborative manner with the dealers, and have just built an awesome mobile application. As well as a desktop application, both of which are completely interlaced into our vAuto provision solution. The dealer never has to leave the platform. The premise behind the product is real simple. We're going to be able to help dealers shorten the amount of time that it takes them to get a car from point of acquisition to front line ready. So we're really excited about that. That product's ready to go, and we're going to be starting to talk to dealers about that this week. Some of the other things that are in our pipeline, one of the things that we created actually mid-pandemic, again, just a shout out to the vAuto product team. One of the things that we recognized was the volatility that occurred in the market right when dealers were ordered to shut down, and as well as how quickly things were changing. So what they did was they created what's called a market days supply trend report. So this is the closest thing really to predictive analytics in terms of understanding where a vehicle's price is going to move when you're buying that car. or when you're putting a price on that car and you're about to expose it to the market. We've got new indicators showing inside the provision tool that'll provide clear guidance for dealers on what they could expect the price movement to look like on that car. In addition to that, we're in discussion with our good partners at vAuto on a product called Stockwave. This is a product that helps dealers solve some of the challenges involved with sourcing cars. Product that's been out for a number of years south of the border, and a product that dealers really like and embrace. We get all kinds of calls. There's probably not a week that goes by that we don't have an inbound lead asking about our new car solution. The new car solution is called Conquest. And again, we're in discussions with our partners, vAuto, about bringing that new car solution up into the Canadian marketplace to be able to help our Canadian dealer partners with new cars, as well as the good work we're doing today on the used cars.
Right on. Thanks, Todd. And thanks, Fabian. That about wraps things up for today's episode of Trader Talks. And I want to thank you both for taking time out of your busy week to join us here and join in this discussion. The feedback that we've been getting from dealers on these has been great. And I think today's discussion will add further value to them. And I hope that both of you can join us in future Trader Talk chapters to talk about other aspects of the used car operation. It's been great. I also want to thank our audience for tuning in and invite all of you to share your thoughts and questions with us online, either through our social channels, through our corporate website, or you can email us directly at b2bmarketing@trader.ca. Likewise, if you have any suggestions on other topics you would like for us to cover in future episodes of Trader Talks, please feel more than free then to share that with us. And please stay tuned for our next episode coming to you soon. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, guys. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, man. Good to see you, Fabian. Take care.
Yeah, take care, guys. Thank you.
See you guys.